let's move on with our next panel discussion on sustainable supply chain. So let's meet the panel for this one. We're joined by Maureen O'Shea, Sustainability and Supply Chain Partner at Baringa. Also with us, Paul Williams, Director, Supply Chain Sustainability at Deutsche Bank. Michael Ford, Principal HSE and Sustainability at Avetta. And on the far side, Caroline Gray, Co-Founder, Chief Revenue Officer at Treefera. A warm welcome for our panel, please. And one thing I noticed when we sat down, there were more whoops from the back. I've had more whoops at this particular event than at any other one I've done. I'm not against it, but you know, let's roll with it. Anyway, sustainable supply chains. Where I'd like to start, if I can, is the current context, where we are and how far we've come on the journey of making truly sustainable supply chains. Maureen, I'll start with you. Your thoughts. How far have we come?
Oh, not far enough. It's not meaning to start the day on a downer. But a lot of organisations have done great work on Scope 1 and Scope 2 and have conveniently ignored Scope 3. I was speaking with one lovely company last week who have in-sourced logistics. They went, if we just outsource it, then our Scope 3 number will go away. And they're, no.
If only it worked like that, if only.
They were at early stages, I feel.
Early stages. Paul?
I'm going to take a bit more of a positive tone and think actually huge progress has been made if we think around 10 years ago to come into a room and talk around Scope 3.
True.
I think people would have still been, I'm not quite sure what that means, what does it mean? And when I speak to some of the CPOs from different organisations, I think actually out of all of the ESG topics, Scope 3 is the one they really understand, not only because it's easier to measure, to monitor, has a commercial benefit potentially, but actually most of our suppliers are talking about Scope 3 as well. So still significantly more to do, but I think actually when I think back to 10 years ago, huge progress seems to have been made.
Yeah, Michael?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, I think over the last 10 years or so I've been working in this space, I think the area of understanding has increased massively. I still think there's a massive confusion between ESG sustainability, people putting the two together and coming up with whatever they do. The big area of challenge I see is cascading this process down to the lower levels of the supply chain. I still think there's a massive area of lack of understanding, especially in the why do I need to do this, etc. And I think one of the big issues is client communication. I think there's a massive failure there in many cases. A lot of the suppliers that we work with struggle to understand client expectations and why they need to provide this. From my perspective, the other positive to take is I do see a move away from the drive for compliance to actually now having that associated with the risk factor as well. In certain sectors, there's some sectors I think are still lagging.
Caroline?
So I'm also optimistic about it. I can see, boards are talking about it, consumers are talking about it. We're all much more aware of the impact we have both personally and also corporately. And I also think technology is moving in the right direction to enable us to measure it, sort of particularly from our point of view in the first mile, which is really putting the whole jigsaw together. So I'm afraid I'm optimistic.
You're allowed to be optimistic, that's absolutely fine. Where I want to go to next, though, is focusing on that progress, as what I hear a lot at these events is much of the low-hanging fruit has gone. If it was easy to do, you've probably already done it for a lot of the major organisations. Is it getting tougher to make really significant progress? Paul, I'll start with you. Is that a fair reflection for you?
I don't think it is. Maybe it's because within the financial services sector, I still think we are fairly immature in terms of sustainability really being embedded within the supply chain. So I think there's still huge amounts of low-hanging fruit that can be obtained, even if it's as simple as, getting transparency, visibility of other tiers within the supply chain, building in and embedding those supplier scorecards is a really good example that we're trying to do within DB, but also just making sure that we can quantify and reward and recognise those suppliers that are leading in this space. Doesn't necessarily mean they have to have had commitments of net zero by a certain date, but actually they're just on the trajectory to understand and communicate and share in a transparent way their sustainability journey. Michael Ford.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, it's you have to look at sustainability in the round. You can't just restrict it to Scope 3. I think it depends on the sector. Some of the sectors, such as construction, aggregates and things that I think are pretty well advanced. The food industry, pretty well advanced, but some of the other sectors, I think, are lagging way, way behind. And I think a lot of that is because they're struggling to actually understand how to apply it because of the size of the supply chain and the demographic of the supply chain. They tend, especially in mainland Europe, where the main demographic is small to micro. And a lot of those don't actually fall under the legislation levels. And I think from our perspective, we're seeing a lot of clients who are increasing their level of uptake, but they're the ones that are actually giving the support and the hand-holding. The ones that are just dictating and mandating, they're the ones that, in our view, are struggling to actually gather anything of meaningful data.
Caroline.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I think, I actually think it's a big opportunity, and I think we'll see quite significant, sort of remarkable speed and changes with regard to bringing the whole picture together, because technology enables that, but also most importantly, when I speak to customers, they're very much thinking about their supply chain risk and the resilience within that risk. So for them now, it's not just regulation that's driving this forward, but it's also a fundamental need to provide good stewardship, but as well as meet the revenue and margin needs that they have. So I think there's a big opportunity.
Maureen.
I think we're all on the same page. There's tremendous opportunity still in front of us. There's wonderful new tools and technology that can help speed that journey. And I think very few people have it all figured out yet. So there's plenty of low-hanging fruit there.
Well, that was positive. I'll take that, absolutely. Let's move on to the challenges. And I do want to return to the questions around sort of SMEs and micros that you mentioned a moment ago, Michael. So I will come back to that if I remember. The biggest challenges businesses are facing when they're trying to make their supply chains more sustainable. Michael, I'll start with you on this one if I can. What are your thoughts there? What are the biggest challenges? What are you seeing?
We act as a third party, so we act on behalf of clients to evaluate and conduct due diligence on their suppliers before they enter any kind of contractual relationship. The challenges that I see and experience globally is the lack of communication on behalf of the client. And it's a fairly common theme. They think they're communicating it, but they are internally. But they're not spreading the love with the suppliers in terms of the messaging. Why are they collecting this information? What are they going to do with that information? Collecting this information, is that going to be a significant factor in giving me a job or not? And one of the things that we have seen at the moment in certain countries, in certain trade sectors, is that suppliers are pushing back and going to work for companies that are not asking. And that is a significant challenge. And what we're trying to work on at the moment, and we're having split success, is how do we do this hand-holding? How do we educate at the right level? And that to us is a massive challenge. And also looking at the integrity of the data and how we maintain it. There's certain countries in mainland Europe where they simply do not want to release the information to a third party or even to the client.
Caroline?
Yeah, I think communication is a key one. I also think the level of complexity when you get into the detail. So one of our customers has 155,000 dairy suppliers across the globe. And it's only in recent times that technology's enabled them to actually be in touch with those types of suppliers, because normally it's through a third party, it's through a consortium or something like that. So I think where the challenge then comes is in order to incentivize, I think the right incentives need to be in place to incentivize right down to the supplier level. And that's something that we've seen with some of our customers that take the right approach. We were talking about this earlier. One of our customers quoted that carbon intensity is now more important, and lower carbon intensity is more important to them than price. So they actually are doing the right thing by providing capital investment to suppliers right in the field to enable them to do more regenerative agriculture. And I think those are the sorts of things that have to be thought through when you're part of a large corporate about how you treat your suppliers. That's
a fascinating example. Maureen?
I think Caroline makes a brilliant point there. Communication and saying this is important is all very well, but everyone in this room either is in procurement or has procured. It tends to be on price. So you're only going to make effective change if you've got the right incentives and penalties system for your suppliers, which uses robust data, sensible data that they can access. We worked with a great client last year, And for each of the key carbon emitting suppliers, there was a target set per supplier, a sensible, reasonable, tailored target per supplier. Then they were held accountable to what they were going to do towards that, and their future scoring for RFPs, for new business, for extra business, was going to include a material amount based on their progress on carbon. So it was very practical.
Paul?
I'm going to pick a different, I agree with the panellists, but I think the other two for me are probably the focus on carbon. I still think that we're in that carbon tunnel and the echo chamber of let's focus on something which we can more easily measure, manage, monitor versus human rights in the supply chain at different tiers, for example. I'm not quite sure how we overcome that without visibility and transparency. And I think the other challenge I would identify is resource. So if I think back to my days in the food industry, the ESG sustainability manager would also be the technical manager, would also be the health and safety manager. And again, that resource challenge around you're asking one person to do a huge amount of data input, data analysis, but actually that's on top of the day job as well. So that resource piece in the supplier, but also within further up the supply chain as well. I would, hope I'm right in saying this for DB. We've got a plethora of data, huge amounts, but we just don't have enough time sometimes to interrogate that, to understand what it means from a supply chain perspective, and also to check and challenge the progress at an individual supplier level. We've got 27,000 different suppliers, so not a huge undertaking. So I think they're the two for me, the carbon tunnel and resource.
Where I want to go next, if I can, is one thing I often find at events like these is I'm always fascinated what conversations I have when I get stopped walking across the networking area. When an arm comes out and you grab, why didn't you ask this? Why aren't you doing this? And this has happened a couple of times today, and it leads on to what we were saying about SMEs or micros. Is enough being done to help the smaller businesses which are all over these supply chains when there's different regulations they need to be fitting into, different criteria they need to have respected, which can be quite easy for a larger organisation to say, everyone should be doing this. You've got to invest X to make that happen. Difficult for some of those SMEs. Is enough being done? What more can be done? Caroline, I'll start with you on this one if I can.
I think there's a good start. I think it's going in the right direction. I definitely wouldn't say enough is being done. And I think it really comes down, I can see the behaviours on both sides, because I think you have, or on a number of sides, but I think the supplier themselves, I think, need to be open, to be transparent, and to be wanting to create this more regen, agri or sustainable environment. I think the end buyer, as consumers, needs to be willing to pay a little bit more for that. I think corporations need to put, as we said, investment into it. And I think then governments, and it's not necessarily about regulation, but I think need to support where their supply chains are and recognise the value that they have within these nature-based assets, which we're definitely seeing. I mean, we're seeing that in a number of the large nature-based asset source countries. But I think all of those things need to keep driving for the same behaviours, because everyone wants it. Everyone wants the decarbonisation. Everyone needs supply chain resilience. So, but I think there's a lot. There's always going to be more that needs to be done in that space.
Maureen.
I think the large companies who care about Scope 3 have an obligation to support and enable their smaller suppliers. So as you said, even Princes, which are big, is a very finite resource. So we worked with a great one last year, and they had gone out to all of their suppliers during COVID and went, Scope 3 is very important. Everyone had nodded, and the Scope 3 continued to go up. They went, so it wasn't lack of will, it was lack of capacity and capability. So they invested in carbon accounting training for their key suppliers. They invested in building a carbon reduction playbook per category. So say for resin, for cardboard. So if you're a cardboard supplier, these are the levers you can pull to reduce your carbon. Had the category managers sit with them and go, these are your options. Here's a list. We're going to talk again in 2 months. What are you doing from the list? So they had to enable and support, not just say you must. Because it's not lack of will, but capacity and capability are a real constraint for SMEs.
And that's a wonderful example of how that responsibility can actually be taken. Paul?
Yeah, echo all of the previous comments. I think for me, this is where progress has been made, but I still think there's more to do around consistency and simplicity. So the more that we can, as industry peers, get together and say, look, 80% of the messaging will be the same, 80% of the resources on training, on water stewardship, human rights and supply, they're all going to be pretty much similar. Yes, we're going to have different logos on the front of the PowerPoint presentation, and perhaps a slightly different approach in terms of timings and targets. But if we can collaborate in a compliant way to share those resources, to make that consistent message, because the feedback that I hear from suppliers is survey fatigue. It's that different survey, pretty much asking the same thing, but in a different way. Now, again, there's some really good examples in the food industry, Manufacture 2030, where they collate and will share those resources. Again, in other sectors, I don't always think that's happening, so there's opportunities to do that.
Michael.
I think from my perspective, I think we have to look at this in a much bigger frame, and that we have to look at the sustainability umbrella, not just focus on Scope 3 or anything like that. We have to look at, to Paul's point, at all the different aspects. And one of the challenges that we've had is how do we do this? Do we rely on technology? Everybody thinks technology is the answer, but you have to look at some of these suppliers. Some of them are still using Gmail and using GoDaddy type web accounts and don't have that understanding, don't have that access. So how do we do the messaging? And for us, it's kind of a little bit, we've gone old school. We've had to go back to webinars, virtual hand-holding, where we're actually giving the message in very, very simplistic language, because one of the challenges, whether we like it or not, especially in the due diligence area, is clients are looking at the risk of suppliers and they're asking for more and more. And in many, many cases, the things they're asking from these smaller companies is not always necessary. And in many cases, this is one of the reasons why they're finding it hard to resource certain areas, because they're going off, well, I can go and work there who's not asking for all this, and then they can't get these suppliers. So I think it's a fine balance, but from our perspective, we've kind of gone backwards, and we're looking at the more basics now of how we do this and how we educate and how we take them on board and bring them with us, you know, whether it be town halls or whatever. It's labor intensive, make no bones about that. But if you don't want supplier pushback, you've got to make it as easy as possible for them to understand why they're doing that.
Just to follow on from that, though, at those sort of town hall events, those sort of educating efforts, Michael, what kind of feedback do you get from those? Are people coming up and saying, why did no one tell us this? Why is this not being covered before? Just briefly, is that the sort of feedback you're getting?
Interestingly enough, and it maybe contradicts with what some of the others have said, the vast majority of the people with the smaller companies have no clue what we're talking about. Yeah, they know about global warming. You know, we know that. But why is that important to me? I build oil buns. Why do you need to know what my Scope 3 is? You know, so we do get a lot of pushback because they don't see the value, because they are small suppliers, even though they are contributing to the client's overall requirements. So from our perspective, we get a lot of negative at times. But once we've communicated the reasons why and what the client's going to do with it, it does tend to change. You're not always going to get a compliant audience, absolutely not. And you're always going to get some who will not do it. And then the client has got to make decisions whether they're going to use that company or not.
It's amazing how often knowing it will lead to more business might tip the scales a little. Just one final question on challenges before we move on, about the main barriers we see when it comes to collaborating with suppliers, but especially those in regions that maybe have less stringent environmental regulations. What kind of barriers do you see, hear about? Maureen, your thoughts?
So at the end of the day, our entire ecosystem is very global, and suppliers, wherever they're based, have a target market, and they're choosing to work there. So if suppliers intend to work in Europe, they know they'll have to work with European regulations. But back to Michael's point, they may be starting from a much lower base. They may need a different type of support. And again, you have to be practical. If you're contracting a European supplier, you can insist that they use renewable energy. Depending on where you're going in China, that may not be an option. So you have to understand their context, and also then, if they're new to working with a European supplier or European customer, help them on the journey and say, look, these are the things I'm asking for, which are must-haves. You need these to be commercially successful here. And these are the extra things I'm asking for that will get more business from us, but help them understand.
Paul.
Again, I think from my perspective, it's, you know, living those values. So if as an organisation you have committed to a target, but you identify within your supply chain that you have no contingent supplier, and you still need to work with this particular supplier irrespective of their sustainability credentials, that's when the really tough decisions need to be made. And that's when obviously CPOs get involved, and you need to have that discussion to say, if the supplier is unwilling to come with us on the journey, what's our plan B? Because, okay, we can't necessarily cut and run. Maybe the right thing to do is help support and engage those particular suppliers. But again, it really depends on the number. If you're talking hundreds of thousands, what's the scale and leverage that you have to do that? And that was my other point in terms of the leverage that you as a buyer have. And this is the importance of kind of coming together as an industry and sector with a common framework, ideas of best practices to share. Because let's be honest, individual buyers may not have the leverage and power to be able to influence positive change.
Michael.
I think one of the biggest reasons why many programs fail is the client tries to impose a one-size-fits-all approach. And we started working in Iraq last year, and that was a vertical learning curve for me. And I think that the key here is you have to be realistic. If you try to set Western stroke, developed country aspirations and goals on a country that is not there yet, whether it be from a statutory point of view or from a willingness point of view to do it, then the scheme will fail. You have to have it in scale, and it has to be done incrementally, and it has to be done by a roadmap. And if you try to suppose whether it be a safety management program, human rights program, it doesn't really matter. If you try to impose standards that are realistically 10, 20, 30 years away, then the program will not have any success and you will not get buy-in. That would be my primary takeaway. And that's the thing that we've had to do. We've had to kind of break it down into developed and emerging markets without putting too many labels on it. And then we've had to look at what works and what doesn't. What's the language we can use? What can we realistically achieve? And if you do that, then you have a fighting chance of getting buy-in. But if you try to impose a standard that's too high, then realistically, even with willingness, they're not going to get there.
A vertical learning curve. I enjoyed that very much. Caroline.
We've sort of had the opposite experience, actually. We've recently had a couple of trips out to Peru where we've been providing data insights on Scope 3 for a number of coffee and cocoa, large-scale and small-scale cocoa growers. And they actually, the thing that I think we probably underestimate is they know the land better than any of us. So yes, you're right. I think you're right. The communication is key with regard to why then these metrics and things are important. But once they understand that communication for them, what those metrics are then converting in at the top of the shop or with regard to the sources, that they actually, for them, we've had a very, very positive experience because for them it's enabling them to give long-term sustainable generation by generational protection of their land, but it's also monetising within year that asset and getting commitments from these organisations to purchase their products. So we've actually had probably a far more positive experience, but could just be lucky. The only thing that failed was my lack of Spanish speaking, I'm afraid. So, and that was a big fail. But
Thank you, Caroline. I want to move on to the solution side of this now, about how we are making supply chains more sustainable and the ways that's happening. We've had a couple of mentions about tech and the potential there. Paul, if I can start for you. How useful is technology, emerging tech, for you in actually improving the situation and making your supply chains more sustainable?
Look, I think tech has definitely got a role to play. I don't want to mention the two letters that probably comes up in every single conversation at the moment, but I think there are opportunities to leverage that. I just don't want it to be seen as the solution, because almost there's the thing of, do we need the tech, do we need the data to really drive the outcomes that we know we need to do? So, for example, within my organisation, we don't necessarily need to do the footprinting of all of the different 15 categories of Scope 3. There's some kind of common sense approaches that we can take immediately to try and address and reduce our Scope 3 footprint. That said, in terms of the communication piece and the messaging, you need to be able to demonstrate, okay, what's been the progress? I just think there's an over-reliance sometimes in terms of data and tech and the focus on dashboards rather than what's that going to mean for outcomes and practical, roll your sleeves up and start to deliver some of this action as well. Otherwise, we're going to be 2050 and hit what we wanted to.
Before I pass this down the line, Paul, if I could just stay with you here and your sort of advice here, and it's a theme I've picked up on a couple of occasions already during the show, is there are so many technological solutions out there. So many of them have got so much to offer. You have an entire encyclopedia of options out there. How do you personally go about working with your team in selecting the right ones that bring you the most benefit? An impossible question, I know.
Yeah, and I think there's almost, when you start the journey of looking at different providers, there's almost that temptation to think there's going to be one provider that can fix everything, that's got the answer to all of the sustainability challenges and opportunities. And my own experience is that just doesn't happen. And actually, there's probably more that you can learn from people that have tried different providers. So again, it's great to have the sales pitches, to do that regular kind of horizon scanning of who's out there. But also, it's really important to understand what's the outcome that you're looking to achieve, because otherwise you could quite quickly fall into the trap of, here's another shiny dashboard and here's another opportunity for us to communicate and showcase some work, whereas actually just be really clear from the outset, what is it that you're looking to achieve with the data provider, with the tech solution? And if you're not quite sure, find that out first would be my recommendation.
Thank you, Paul. Michael, your thoughts on tech and the role of tech in solutions here?
Yeah, it's funny you mention AI, because everyone in the States where I work a lot is getting quite animated about it and see it as the silver bullet. My trail of thought is a little bit different. I think it has its place, but because the majority of the suppliers we work with fit into the small to micro sector, what we found is going back to old school and getting them actually just to fill forms out. So if we're looking at the 15 categories, for example, where we do use the tech is we can produce videos showing them how to read a bill, how to understand what different parts of their emissions fit into this category, that category, and it's done in an animation type format. But a lot of them find it far easier to fill a form in and type the number in and send it in. The more sophisticated companies, they don't have an issue with the tech side. But we have to kind of look at how can we get this information from these smaller guys. And we've had to literally go backwards to go forwards. And if we start talking about tech and AI and things like that, that's it. People's eyes will start glassing over and like, what are you talking about? Some of them can't navigate a keyboard, but they do a fantastic job building walls or whatever it might be. So from our perspective, we've found far more success filling forms in and then us taking that data and being able to produce analytical data for the clients. Where it sometimes does fall down is sometimes they struggle to understand what the messaging is and what we need to do with it. So, but again, that's just, it's work in progress for us as well. And we are trying to improve the process to make it easy for them and reduce the burden. The one area where I do see issues is that clients ask the same questions, but ask it in different ways. Mm-hmm. So they could be working for 10 clients and having to provide 10 different answers, but it's all the same data. So there's no real joined up thinking, and that's one of the areas where I think we do need to come to a solution, because even some of the big tech providers do it differently, but they're asking the same thing.
Thank you, Michael. And don't worry, AI has already been ticked off our bingo cards today. I think synergy is still on there. That hasn't been said yet. When that comes up, just raise your hand. Caroline, if I can come to you.
I'll try and get that in. So first off, I obviously need to say that Treefera is a tech company, so I recognise already people might think I'm biased. But I actually agree with the points. I mean, technology is an enabler. I think the big difference for me, what we're seeing, is that, we are at a change in time where AI is ubiquitous. As we say, it's the worst it's ever going to be for us today. Mm-hmm. We've then got compute. The cost of compute has come down hugely. So therefore, we can afford to run these very, very complex computes with lots of data. But really, the big change is, we always say at Treefera, it's going to take many of us to pull together in what is a very complex chain of solutions that's required, which requires people, process, and technology, good old-fashioned statement. But with that, what I would say is definitely what I've seen, exactly what you've said, is we produce insights that are then digestible, easily digestible by many different parties. And I think that's been the big thing, that there's an acceleration to capital for people. There's a better understanding of where people are all at. It's transparent, discoverable and understandable. And I think that's the key, the message that we all have to get across. But of course, there's many different ways of doing it.
Maureen.
So I think the themes are consistent. AI is not a silver bullet, not for sustainability, not for any of our other business challenges. As ever, we need to be business-led, technology-enabled. And the tech's very exciting. Our toolbox as practitioners of solutions is now much bigger. But what we want to avoid is being a hammer in search of a nail. What is the problem we're trying to solve? How are we going to tackle that? And then we open the toolbox. And a lot of the solutions will be powered by large language models, will be high-tech. But we don't pick a solution and go, this is my silver bullet.
Where I want to go next, before we come to any questions from the room, is, well, Michael, you've used this sort of expression a couple of times about going back to basics and actually going back to, as you say, forms, education, or so on. How important is it that we do consider approaches like, I don't know, nearshoring, for example, or other approaches like that, rather than just reaching for tech or similar approaches? What are your thoughts there? Do we need to sometimes go back to basics on some of those other solutions to try and make improvements to our sustainable supply chains?
For us, to be honest with you, it's a no-brainer. We've had to do it because we've looked at the tech solutions and the suppliers were struggling. So for us, we thought, well, what's the solution? And so we went back to using form collections, data, showing them how to do it, producing interactive videos on how to do it and how to complete it. And to the untrained, to a trained eye, you'd actually look at it and think, well, this is pretty damn basic. But you've got to remember, some of these people don't understand the subject. So for us, we've got to make it as easy as possible and make it as simple and as quickly as possible to fill it in as well. Because there's been asked, like I say, I've mentioned before, clients keep asking and asking for more and more data. In many cases, they do it to tick boxes and don't use the data, to be honest. And it stops suppliers from wanting to work with them. And that's so we've looked at the form taking, and we think the form processing is, at this moment in time, the most effective. We're working in emerging economies where, to be honest with you, it's the only way, because in some cases we don't even have internet there, especially some of the more remote locations. So from my perspective, I think it's essential. Will it evolve? Yes. How long will it be? Who knows? But I don't think we're ever going to get away from that, because there's always going to be small suppliers. And the biggest demographic in the EU is small to micro.
Caroline, your thoughts there about the way we can approach these things, in whether it's going back to basics, different tech. How creative do we have to be here?
So I don't know if it's necessarily about being creative. I wouldn't necessarily go for the form filling, and I don't mean that rudely.
Well, it's the right approach for the right supplier.
No, exactly, the right approach. And the reason I say that is I think that whether we like it or not, and regulation, you can wait 20 years, 50 years for regulation, but whether we like it or not, and I know it's slowing, but regulation is still playing a part. Mm-hmm. So the whole thing is with people typing, onto a computer or filling a form, that is always open to a very bias or something, that information that people, is always open to risk of that data being actually correct. So I think the challenge with it, when you look at this, how vast and how big this both problem but also opportunity is, and I'm sorry to use the term, but that's where I think AI plays a very big part in actually assessing what's actually happening on the ground. Now, that doesn't solve the child labour. We have before been asked, can you spot small people? No, definitely not. But so there is also risk. I'm not saying it's a perfect solution, but I just think there's a mix of things. Can I just touch on the nearshore? Because I know your original question was about nearshoring. Personally, I don't think that's the answer either. And the reason being, I think, of course there are benefits, but as we know, the actual impact of transportation and travel is relatively small to the impact of what's happening on the ground. And I also think we have to think about people's long-term livelihoods, where biomes in themselves have their natural ingredients and the natural raw materials and what is right to grow where. So I think sort of suddenly having a big thing to say nearshore everything would just present another set of GHG problems that we probably don't already have. So again, I think, like any of these, there isn't a straightforward, simple solution, but I think there's one that as long as we can help people, be more sustainable, and I mean from a regenerative approach, then I think we'll get into a better place.
Yes, if it was straightforward and simple, I don't think we'd all be sitting here today. Maureen?
When we think about that sort of, not quite the easy wins, but certainly going back to the basics, I think there is, back to your point, Paul, there's a lot of companies that there's still some low-hanging fruit. I see my colleague David in the audience, and he works a lot in green logistics, and he always talks about the green gold. So the easiest things to go for, before you start taking the carbon out of your transport methods, reduce your miles, transport the product less, simplify things, consolidate things that will also drive cost savings, and that often we've known for years would drive cost savings, but sales said, oh no, that'll increase the lead time by half a day. But now you can go back and go, okay, it'll save money and it'll move me towards carbon. So the green gold is probably some of the easiest thing, particularly in the current economic climate, to get forward.
Yeah, I like that expression. Paul, final word on this, please.
I mean, my view is probably not looking at the kind of pros and cons of offshore and nearshoring. It's more about the supply chain traceability and transparency, because if I think around a bank and financial services, part of the challenge that we have at the moment is understanding the water footprint of our organisation. So working with the data and tech providers to say, okay, where are you located? Where are your data centres located? How resource heavy are they in terms of water for cooling? And actually that's a huge potential impact. That for me is more the discussion and listening to suppliers to learn, okay, what are you doing specifically to address that challenge? Have you thought about it? Do you need any help and support and guidance from us? Because I think actually the solution is with the supplier. So it's better to invest our time to try and listen to them and understand, have they thought about this or not? But it's more, instead of telling them you need to approach this strategy in terms of location, it's more around, have you thought about the physical risks, the transition risks, about your own supply chain, and can you be transparent with us on that journey?
Thank you, Paul. The time is rapidly running away from us, so let's quickly go to any questions from the room. Do we have any immediate questions for the panel? This is where I'm squinting. We do, just in the middle. Izzy, if we can just get to the mic just in the middle there. I think this is slightly better than me leaping off the stage and chasing out, so.
Thank you. Yeah, my question is around the cost of achieving Scope 3 and various programs. There's a lot of talk about the smaller businesses. I'm just thinking about the impact of NI contributions going up very, very imminently. And is there a danger there where the smaller businesses think, well, we've got two choices: either make money or counter those costs, or invest in becoming Scope 3 compliant. I just wonder if the panel had any views on that.
I'm happy to jump in with my view. I think ultimately we're going to see, probably in the future, a carbon view of taxation which makes it imperative, and the business case actually translates from a do we have to do this to actually this is now a financial, commercial implication for us, because there will be a cost of the tax and the footprint that we have related to carbon or water or other types of resource. So I think that's really the opportunity for the business. Again, I appreciate that might be 5, 10, 25 years away, who knows, but I feel that there's more around the discussion now with some suppliers about talking about carbon pricing within the supply chain, which again is sowing the seeds for that. And so in the future, if an organisation is able to map that and demonstrate how they can reduce that, there is going to be a financial, commercial benefit to doing so. But I appreciate as of today and right now, that is a really difficult dilemma, particularly with the headwinds that we all face.
Thank you. Okay, any further questions before we look to wrap things up? No, I think we're good there. My last question is a look to the future, though, and that's when it comes to trying to future-proof supply chains in terms of sustainability in such an evolving market. What advice would all of you have for any procurement or supply chain leaders out there? How can you go about future-proofing? I know that could fill up an entire discussion. I've completely lost track of the order of who's answering questions, so Maureen, you're closest to me. After you.
There's a few things. One is design for success, partly with your R&D. In procurement, you choose how to buy, not what to buy. Engage upstream with R&D, engage with manufacturing on what you're buying, because that can often drive it. Be intentional in your choices of suppliers. invest in your suppliers, engage with your suppliers. So if you've got a long-term relationship with them, you can have those more difficult conversations around investment now for trade-offs later. And then be really pragmatic, be practical, work with them, and then towards a together endpoint that you're getting to.
Paul.
I think when we think of future-proofing, we can think around kind of a longer-term strategy. And actually for an organisation, it may be quarter by quarter, week by week that some of these decisions are being taken. So I think my advice would be understand and map your stakeholders, understand who are the decision makers, and try to understand what positions are they coming from. Is it a cost imperative? If so, talk around the cost of carbon. Maybe that's the selling point and the hook. Is it around the right thing to do? Fantastic. It's very unlikely, I would imagine, in most organisations that is the case. But it's just really trying to understand what's the agenda, what's the thought process of those decision makers, and how do you translate and really simplify sustainability so it meets their objectives, so they feel that it is embedded within the organisation and not a separate kind of bolt-on activity.
Thank you. Michael.
So just to add to what's just been said, I think the couple of things for me and my takeaway is the clients need to be very, very clear on their expectations in terms of what they want from the suppliers. And the other thing as well is to future-proof is to make sure the solutions, the processes, the programs you're using to gather data, whether it be carbon data, human rights data, doesn't really matter, to make sure that it is suitable for the size of supplier. Because the one-size-fits-all detracts from that. There's a very large international program that looks at human rights and ethical trading, and whether you employ 2 people or 20,000, it doesn't matter, you get given the same program. So to me, that's the clear element, is making sure that it's suitable for the size of supplier, and then that way they can grow with you as a business, and you can roadmap it, and it's incremental.
And Caroline, I'll give you the final word.
Yeah, I would just say be transparent and holistic in the approach. I think that, you know, ultimately this is an ecosystem. This is, whether you look at it from a company's financials or a supply chain production itself. You know, if everybody looks after the supply chain in itself, the stewardship takes care of itself, the revenues take care of themselves, you'll continue to grow, the margins will get bigger, you'll have more supply chain resilience, and also all parties will be able to monetize those very positive assets in many ways. So I think, you know, the more people are transparent and open about where they're at, and then looking at it in the total view, will be a very good way to future-proof.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed. We are out of time. I've barely scratched the surface of the things I wanted to get through, but we've got through as much as we possibly can. Coming up in just a second will be our next fireside, which is with Jared Glover, Director of Procurement at Santander. That'll be next. But for now, my thanks to Maureen, to Paul, to Michael, and to Caroline. Thank you very much.